Welcome to the technical webinar of the ABS Capacity Development Initiative on what the title is, the role of indigenous peoples and local communities and associated traditional knowledge in the DSI debate, which is a big topic, as you can picture. And I see that we have almost 100 participants now, with more coming in. So apparently you are part and parcel of this science policy process that has been kicked off by COP14, which has acknowledged this divergence of opinions of different parties on DSI under the CBD. And we, the ABS Capacity Development Initiative, I'm Suhail Al-Janavi, the co-manager of the initiative, under the partnership between Norway and South Africa, were asked to facilitate this process in an informal way with dialogues, webinars, studies, side events. We will say some words on that during the course of the meeting. And that includes global webinars, of which this is one element, which we organize in close collaboration with the Secretariat of the Convention on Biological Diversity, and do this, of course, in preparation to the Open-Ended Working Group 3 on the Global Biodiversity Framework, so that parties, stakeholders have the opportunity to inform themselves on aspects that are related to different angles of digital sequence information. This webinar is the first of 3 events on specific topics. We will say some words on that at the end of the webinar, and it is in particular now looking at the role of indigenous peoples and local communities in relation to benefit sharing options to the use of digital sequence information. It has been quite often said that there is a role for IPLCs, and that IPLCs would need to be considered in this debate, and we are making here now an attempt to raise the curtain in that regard and to trigger the discussions next. Yes, so what is it that you can expect from today? We will have a brief introduction on the objective of the webinar, some setting the scene, some introductory remarks on cornerstones of what is important and what the international debate and the international fora are related to in this debate. We'll have a panel of very interesting panelists that are partially IPLCs themselves, or having IPLCs as a constituency, or are dealing with data which to some extent derives from traditional knowledge in a roundtable. And then, of course, we will wrap up and look forward on how one can make use of the different elements and ideas floated in this webinar.
So I'm going to do a very short introduction, basically to outline the issues that are involved around the whole discussion on DSI and the implications that that has for the rights of indigenous people and local communities to their traditional knowledge associated with genetic resources. And I think the starting point, obviously, for any such discussion is to recognize that IPLCs have recognized rights and roles. They have rights to their territories, resources, knowledge, innovations, and practices. And these rights are recognized and protected to various extents under customary law, national law, the CBD, the Nagoya Protocol, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and to a certain extent also recognized in the International Treaty on Genetic Resources for Food and Agriculture. Um, and fundamentally, under the ABS architecture as it is constituted at the moment, IPLCs have the right to grant or refuse free, prior, informed consent for the utilization of their genetic resources and associated traditional knowledge. Now, in the international instruments, this is of course made subject to domestic legislation, and the extent to which that right is then expressed or observed at national level varies quite a bit from country to country. But in general, the idea is that IPLCs have the right to free, prior, informed consent, and they also have the right to benefit fairly and equitably from utilization of their genetic resources and associated traditional knowledge on mutually agreed terms. And there's also, of course, an increasing global recognition of the crucial role that IPLCs play in safeguarding biodiversity. You know, the figure that has been often quoted lately is that they occupy 6% of the land and protect 80% of terrestrial biodiversity. And at this stage, it's not clear yet, I would say, how these rights and responsibilities and positive impacts on biodiversity will be included in the post-2020 global biodiversity framework. So, oh dear. So we have the traditional ABS model where, you know, the resources, various genetic resources and associated traditional knowledge that are, you know, come from a country of origin or providing group, IPLC group, through the process of consent for free, prior, informed consent and the conclusion of mutually agreed terms in an ABS contract, you know, are then utilized, and then there's benefit sharing back to the country of origin or the providing community. But then there's this problem, right, where the utilization nowadays includes the genetic sequencing. And genetic sequencing then leaves this closed loop of the traditional ABS model. And I'll get back to that later, but this creates all kinds of problems, right? So even if free, prior, informed consent is granted and the genetic resources and knowledge is then accessed and used, the reality of modern biology is that genetic sequencing has become so cheap and quick and ubiquitous that almost all of those resources will now be sequenced. And those sequences will be shared on open access databases. And sharing these sequences is not an optional thing in many cases, because researchers are obliged to get research funding. Their funding conditions would oblige them to share the sequences, and they wouldn't be able to publish their research results in peer-reviewed academic publications unless they also publish the sequences, the basic data on which the research is based. And then once it's DSI, I mean, DSI can, in a very direct way, be used to identify aspects of traditional knowledge, what I call embodied associated traditional knowledge. For example, the useful traits of traditional breeds of animals, or the characteristics of traditional cultivars or land races of plants, and the activity of medicinal plants. DSI can be used to identify that, at least to the extent that they are genetically encoded. And currently, the databases have no provision or technical capacity to record this associated traditional knowledge. And in fact, are resisting efforts to add such information to the data entries, although it's technically quite easy to do it. And there's the additional complication that most national ABS laws don't apply to digital sequence information, and that no user compliance regulations currently cover DSI. Then once the DSI has been uploaded into the databases, basically the philosophy there at the moment is to provide open and free access to the information. And the INSTC, the International Nucleotide Sequence Data Collaboration or Coalition, they are refusing to add such terms and conditions. And in fact, in the user terms, they recognize that while there might be rights in over the sequences, they take no responsibility for such rights. Basically, it's left up to the users. They do have country of origin labels, but these are not used consistently by people who deposit sequences into the databases, and they are not verified by the databases themselves, which is obviously an issue of their capacity to do so, the cost of doing so, the legal liability that might arise from doing this, and makes them very reluctant to enter into this kind of managing the data that they otherwise make available, store and make available. So what happens is that the sequence information that comes from genetic resources and embodied traditional knowledge that belong to IPLCs, it ends up mixed in with all of the other sequences that come from other sources, and it can't be easily separated from other DSI. On the other hand, a large part of the value of DSI collections derives from the ability for users to search large data sets for similarities and differences. This activity of compare and contrast. What is similar to my sequence? What is different from my sequence to the background set? That's really, in the use value of the database, is a very large consideration. And some of the users involve thousands of sequences or accessions for reference and discovery, which are used by users, but none of them are used in the eventual commercial application of the invention or the discovery, whatever results from that utilization. And so you have then this like growing problem, right, where the agreement and the issue that the graphic I shared with you before, now you have this cutout where the information goes into the data bank. There's no longer a tag associated with it. That means that the ABS contract or the mutually agreed terms is not captured and stored in the database. Then there's global access and free open access to this database. All right, the information is taken from that and used for development, for research product development by third parties, including for commercial use and non-commercial use. And from that, because there was no link to the ABS contract or the mutually agreed terms, there's no benefit sharing that goes back to the original provider country or the IPLCs that provided these resources. And that really leads to this problem that, we have invisible traditional knowledge. So these sequences that encode embodied traditional knowledge, they can only be identified by comparing them with similar sequence from other accessions. But discovering the sequences that code for these useful traits, it doesn't require reference to the associated traditional knowledge. Right. So, even if an IPLC knows, for example, that a particular animal is tick resistant or particular plant is disease resistant, the sequences that code for those traits can be found, for example, from material from a gene bank, and then the databases can be searched for similar sequences. And so it might well happen that researchers find matching sequences in genetic resources sourced from IPLCs, but there's no record of the providers or their associated traditional knowledge in the data bank. Right? And the upshot of all of this, the outcome of this whole system is that the current DSI's ecosystem enables users to bypass ATK and free prior informed consent. But not only does it enable them bypassing this, it makes recognizing and respecting IPLC rights much more expensive and difficult than simply ignoring them and using the data in a straightforward way. So are there better options to this current dysfunctional system? And I want to point out that provider countries and IPLCs face exactly the same dilemma here. The DSI is used to bypass ABS and negate their rights. All right. But also, but also the use of DSI creates benefits that could potentially be shared.
Yeah, could you be a bit slower for the translators? Thanks.
Sorry, thank you. I'll do that. So, and the traditional bilateral negotiated free pick and mac solutions only work for very specific cases, right? Where you already know that a particular accession has a high value, and the use of sequences can be restricted in mutually agreed terms. But that's a very suboptimal solution, because then you would end up a situation where people are accessing thousands or tens of thousands of genomes, and they would have to deal with these separate and different mutually agreed terms attached to each of those accessions. So as a result of that problem, there seems to be, and I'm not saying this is necessarily a universal perception, but there seems to me at least to be an emerging consensus in the DSI discussions that a multilateral system for DSI benefit sharing would be the best policy option. And of course, if such a system is created and it is structured to work in the right way, then IPLCs are potentially major beneficiaries of a multilateral benefit sharing system, because they provide or have provided much of the most useful material that is sequenced in the databases. And also because they have the most credible claim to benefits that are supposed to support sustainable use and conservation, because of their central role in the conservation of biodiversity. So on the basis of that, which was really meant as a provocation, the questions that I would suggest would be interesting for the panel to discuss is exactly what are the issues involved in this system? What are the options for fixing it? And how can we ensure that the voices of IPLCs are heard and their concerns are addressed as we go forward with this? Now, as part of the introduction, we've also invited Shakil Bhatti, who many of you will know, who's with WIPO, the Division on Genetic Resources, Traditional Knowledge and Folklore at the moment, but was also previously the Executive Secretary of the International Treaty. And Shakil will add a few perspectives to this introduction before we move on to the panel discussion. Thank you very much for your attention.
Very good. Well, thank you, Pierre, and thank you to the ABS initiative for inviting WIPO to participate in this online event today. It's really a pleasure to join you on behalf of WIPO. And from a WIPO perspective, today's online discussion is relevant really for two reasons which converge in the current debates that we summarize as the DSI debates. And the first one is very, very practical, and that is WIPO maintains an extensive work program on genetic resources and traditional knowledge under its traditional knowledge division. The traditional knowledge division in WIPO works directly with IPLCs and other TK holders in order to address their intellectual property needs, and including those referring to DSI. And we have worked a lot with the ABS initiative, of course, in the past. The second reason is really legal and conceptual. And that is that DSI is first and foremost, inherently, an abstract object. It is a pure information good, and therefore it is, above all, an intellectual property issue. Because for DSI, in contrast to genetic resources as a whole, from the outset, they form an abstract intellectual asset in which the information content has been detached from the biological macromolecules, which were its original carrier, its original material carrier. And this detachment occurs through the application of the human mind and intellect. So therefore, DSI, from the outset, per definition, is an intellectual property issue. And that's why the range of subject matter that we today summarize as DSI, with this umbrella term, is legally, in the first place, subject of intellectual property law. And this is the reason why WIPO's Traditional Knowledge Division conducts a range of extensive training and capacity building activities, including especially for IPLCs, who are very active and important stakeholders in genetic resources, about intellectual property and genetic sequence data. And given this kind of context and background, the Traditional Knowledge Division has conducted activities for a number of years that cover DSI and inter alia, and the subjects that are being discussed today. And I would like to briefly mention just 5 of them, and then conclude with 3 observations on the role of IPLCs that have been derived from those activities. So let me briefly mention first, in January of this year, WIPO conducted a seminar on intellectual property and genetic resources, which included a panel on new and emerging technologies. And this panel discussed DSI for the first time, specifically in an intellectual property context, which relates to genetic resources and TK particularly. And I'd like to specify here that that seminar was not part of the WIPO Intergovernmental Committee on Intellectual Property and Genetic Resources, Traditional Knowledge and Folklore, or IGC for short. And I will not be covering the work of the IGC now in today's discussions, but rather that seminar had the objective to first create a space for exchanging empirical information about IP, DSI, GRs, TK, and to facilitate an exchange of perspectives among stakeholders, including IPLCs, and to identify new ideas. So with those objectives in mind, the WIPO seminar addressed a range of important issues that are being negotiated in the IGC. Thank you, I shall speak slowly for the translation. The seminar identified a range of issues that are under negotiation in the IGC and gave some very insightful historical accounts of how those issues have evolved on the international stage. It also shared information about the experiences of countries and the views of IPLCs, as well as industry and other stakeholders. And it informed about new data mining techniques and machine learning techniques that can increasingly unlock information from the patent system. And in particular, the participants learned a lot about new technologies utilizing DSI that are disrupting current business models and legal frameworks. The second activity, and these seminars are online on the WIPO Traditional Knowledge Division website. Secondly, WIPO publishes a series of Traditional Knowledge Division briefs, which are short, very accessible summaries of the IP issues arising for GRs and TK for non-specialists. And in this series, there is a one brief number 10, which deals with IP and genetic resources. And this has been updated to include the DSI issues. So for a concise, accessible summary that is available. Thirdly, the WIPO Traditional Knowledge Division maintains an online database of ABS contracts that contain intellectual property clauses. And this database also includes a whole series of contracts that structure and regulate TK in ABS context. And also it includes contracts that regulate DSI in an ABS context. For example, we have the original contract of the historically important rice genome sequencing project, which for the first time created a whole reference genome for ORIZA for rice. And based on that database, together with ABS initiative, we have published a guide on IP issues in ABS contracts, which also refers briefly to how to handle DSI issues. Fourth, the Traditional Knowledge Division also runs an international training program on IP and genetic resources in support of innovation, together with the Swedish Patent and Registration Office, which has also a strong focus on emerging issues such as DSI and addresses those linkages. And fifth and finally, WIPO has just launched a new distance learning course on intellectual property and genetic resources in the life sciences. And this course is open to IPLCs and other TK holders, and it's available at reduced fees for participants from developing countries and free of charge for LDCs. And the course, inter alia, addresses IP issues that pertain to genetic sequence data, so-called DSI, both in the patent, trade secret, copyright, and regulatory data protection context. And there's a limited number of seats in this course, but registration is still open until this weekend and available on the WIPO Traditional Knowledge Division website. So anybody's welcome to join. So just to conclude from these past activities, multiple observations have been drawn on the role specifically of IPLCs and associated TK in the range of questions that today we summarize as DSI. And these observations have generally been located at three levels. First is IPLCs as stakeholders, which policy stakeholders, which relates to their participation in policy-making processes. And the WIPO IGC takes place with the direct and active participation of IPLCs as the only intergovernmental IP process, because the relevance of IPLC participation for a vibrant and inclusive modern innovation ecosystem in the field of genetic resources has been recognized by the WIPO member states. And if the member states decide to continue this approach, it would imply that whatever is decided on DSI from an IP perspective would aspire to take into account the perspectives of IPLCs. Secondly, is IPLCs as implementers, which relates to capacity building. WIPO's, for example, WIPO's Traditional Knowledge Division conducts a wide range of capacity building activities for all GRTK stakeholders, but in particular also for IPLCs. And this includes, for example, a dedicated WIPO training and mentoring program for Indigenous women entrepreneurs, which currently mentors also Indigenous women scientists who work with molecular characterization techniques on genetic resources. And just like in the biodiversity policy-making fora, such as the CBD, the Plant Treaty, and others, the critical role of IPLCs has been recognized for in situ conservation of biodiversity. In the same way, the WIPO IGC has recognized the crucial role of IPLCs in innovation policy concerning genetic resources, and therefore addresses also their perspectives. And given the pace of legal and technological developments on DSI, it's therefore crucial that it's crucial for IPLCs not to be left behind in the understanding of these technological and legal developments, that further information and training resources are also made available to them. And this is what the Traditional Knowledge Division addresses. And finally, third are IPLCs as innovators and creators themselves, of course, which relates to the role of IP management. And as Pierre earlier expressed in his presentation, the view that in some cases TK might be seen as being embodied in the DSI, where, for example, land races or farmers' varieties or traditional breeds have acquired genetic traits due to selection, farmers' selection and crossing, that if that is indeed the case, then this might raise the question whether such TK, which was embodied in DSI, from the point of view of IPLCs, rights
Pardon,
management.
j'avais oublié d'allumer le micro, je m'excuse. Donc, ceci sera couvert maintenant dans le contexte de la protection et la législation. Et peut-être dans ce...
might shed some light on those questions. And so, in conclusion, based on all these ongoing work of WIPO, WIPO will continue to address the IP issues relating to DSI as well as those relating to TK and IPLCs continuously. And the traditional knowledge division will continue to increasingly explore the IP aspects of these issues, which are being discussed in this webinar today. And for any particular additional information or needs that you might have, please do feel free to contact us directly at grtkf@wipo.int, and we'll be happy to be available. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Hartmut, and thank you also to Pierre and Shaquille for setting the scene. My name is Paul Oldham. I'm an applied anthropologist, and many years ago, when I was a younger man, it was my privilege to live and work with the Wataha and indigenous peoples in the Amazon in Venezuela. And following that, I started working on access and benefit sharing and genomics. So in today's panel, it's my pleasure to welcome 3 panelists who are going to bring a range of different perspectives on the role of indigenous peoples and local communities and TK in the debate on DSI. This webinar is really intended to be the kind of start of a wider discussion on potential options and potential solutions on DSI and TK and the rights of indigenous peoples rather than the end of one. So in particular, we hope to kind of try and tease out some potential practical approaches to the issue that might contribute to the wider discussions without arriving at kind of favored conclusions. So we're going to start with a perspective from the scientific community. So we're going to start with Christian Tiambo from the Center for Tropical Livestock Genetics and Health at the International Livestock Research Institute in Nairobi in Kenya. So Christian is a research scientist working in genomics and as an ABS officer. His work is focused on genomics and African chicken biobanking and cattle breeding. His work in genomics has also included the detection of candidate genes for genetic genomic improvement in chicken and cattle breeding. So Christian, I think it's easy to get the impression that traditional knowledge isn't really relevant in genomics, that it's somehow kind of divorced from genomics. I wanted to ask you if you could say something about the role of traditional knowledge in your work and why it's important. I'm also hoping that you might be able to say something about these questions that Pierre was raising about issues around metadata around sequences and why those are important. So please, Christian, you have the floor.
Okay, thank you very much, Paul. Are you getting me well?
Yeah, yes, we are. We can hear you quite well.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, everybody. Thank you to the ABS initiative for inviting us to this discussion. And we have been collaborating on some other discussions on DSI. So I am Christian Tiambo, and I work for the Center for Tropical Livestock Genetics and Health, as Paul said, and based at ILRI in Nairobi. And you know that ILRI works for better life through livestock, mostly in developing countries. So allow me to introduce a bit ILRI to you so that we have a better view of where we stand with regard to indigenous people and local communities, ABS, and traditional knowledge. So, and in ILRI, we work with partners to apply established approaches to neglected system, while simultaneously seeking for innovative solutions which can accelerate traditional approaches for breeding, like example, using genomic tools to accelerate breedings or to skip the traditional approaches which were probably taking very long. And we also know very well that with the advance of the improvement of genetic tools, advance of high density SNP genotyping as that was mentioned earlier by the panelist, combined with improved statistical method for the use of this data, the data developed through the genomic tools to estimate, for example, the animal breeding values, etc. All this has resulted to extensive applications of genomics or to whole genome research to implement genomic selections. And this is providing opportunities to detect quantitative trace loci and to uncover the genetic architectures of those traits in terms of the distribution size of genetics effects and contribute to trait differences in populations. So particularly for the CTLGH from the Center for Tropical Livestock Genetics and Health, we also focus mostly on developing and applying genomic tools in diverse livestock production system, different settings, through different programs that we have. We have the dairy genomics, the poultry genomics, the reproductive technologies, where I am focusing on biobanking, as Paul said, and the health genetics. And for this, you see that the center of all these activities is genetics and genomics. So these 4 programs are highly dependent on access to genetic resources from our partners, the providers from different institutions across Africa. And this, for us to be efficient on that, we need to train, and we have been training our scientists also to make sure that they really comply to the different regional and local regulations, legislation with respect to access and benefit sharings. And this may be why we have developed such kind of posters, which are available here and in different corridors, where at any time scientists should be able to see exactly what they are supposed to do from the time they are planning their research. They're still thinking about applying for proposals, applying for the pick and match, and when they are starting, when they are being granted the pick and match and they are preparing to go to the field where they meet really the local partners, the indigenous people and local communities, etc., and what they are supposed to do when they have obtained the data, the genetic materials, maybe they have published, what is their duty, what are their duties with respect or vis-a-vis the local communities once they have their research is completed. So, and we will see that in general, for all the work we are doing in genomics, the genomic sequences generated by all the scientists from the different domains I mentioned here will make no sense without our FIT programs on bioinformatics and bioresources. And this FIT program provide a comprehensive and accessible biological informatics and data resource to really drive the tropical livestock genetics and health development improvement. And this is done by the integrations of the genomic or sequencing data with the metadata. And here, the metadata may be including the traditional knowledge. So this means the genomic data or the digital sequence informations only have value in the context of what is already known by the scientists or by the local communities. And most of the time, in genomics explorations, so what is already known can be the phenotypic traits that the animal may be displaying, the performances of the genetic resources in specific environment, specific communities, agroecological zones, etc. The history of the evolution of that genetic resources and its adaptability to that specific environment, and the local communities should be the best people to know exactly how that genetic resources have been evolving or improving or adapting to these different changing conditions in their environment. And of course, the traditional knowledge and the different usage associated to that genetic resources, and whose the custodians are no other people than the indigenous people, local communities in their local context and their natural environment. So all this will be gathered into what is called now the metadata, because this can be the phenotypic or the data connecting to the animals, or the knowledge of the animals in their environment for adaptability, or the use that local populations have been making from that animals, and the reason why these genetic resources have been conserved. And this means for the scientists, it is only that information, that what we are calling here metadata, which is allowing to build links between disparate blocks of detailed genomics information and put it into perspective for use, for efficient use. And this also provides information about data and give a context to the research that we should be doing. And this metadata as well are essential to correctly interpret the data that are generated, because the sequences themselves means nothing if you don't have such kind of metadata. And this also allows the scientists to carry out meaningful comparisons with data from other samples or other studies to take right conclusions and right decisions for conservation, for improvement, etc. And this also allows researchers to find and retrieve data by searching in the different gene bank or data resources available from previous research, for example. And so this provides easy path to integrate his genomics or his different omics works into the public repository. But we should know also that this is not going without challenges. Of course, challenges associated with metadata. Some of them may be the accuracy of the information that are provided, maybe by the local community, and their consistency in the respective environment, knowing that people are changing, their habits are changing, the environment is changing. And if you want to make good comparisons between different populations, it should be good that those information obtained is accurate and is consistent.
Okay, thank you, Christian. I think that's really a great introduction. So if you don't mind, I'll just stop you there, because I think the key point that you're making about metadata is that in the discussions on DSI, there's a real kind of focus on the sequences themselves, rather than the value that kind of is around the sequences, which is where the value comes from. So I'm going to move on to our next speaker and come back to you during the discussion. So our next speaker is Jane Anderson. Jane is Associate Professor of Anthropology and Museum Studies at New York University. Jane is a co-founder of Local Context, which supports Indigenous peoples with the management of intellectual property and digital data. With Maui University from the Maui Hudson from the University of Waikato, who is in the audience in the chat. Jane co-founded the Biocultural Labels initiative, which extends a traditional knowledge labels initiative to digital objects. So Jane is going to talk about the Biocultural Label Initiative, and Maui, I'm hoping, may be able to add some kind of questions and clarifications from the chat for other participants. Jane, you have the floor.
Thank you, everyone. It's lovely to be here. Can you hear me okay?
Sure, yeah, we can, yeah.
Okay, I'm here in Bunjaland country. I'm just going to share my screen for a second.
Okay, we can see the slide.
I just also want to begin by, can you see it? Can you see the slide? Yeah.
Yes, we can.
Can you hear me okay? Okay, thank you. I've got a little bit of dodgy internet. I'm so sorry about that. I also just want to begin by thanking the ABS initiative for the invitation to be part of this. I also want to thank Paul for moderating this, and Pierre and Shaquille for setting the grounds for the discussion. I want to connect into exactly what Christian was talking about, thinking about the practical mechanisms for protection and governance of IPLC knowledge and data. And particularly I want to talk about this initiative that is really an intervention that focuses on the value of contextual metadata, particularly within this DSI conversation, moving it into a discussion about metadata and also the development of fields for metadata. This work, as Paul spoke about, is a collaboration between Maui Hudson and myself. Maui is from the Whakatohea Nation in Aotearoa, New Zealand, and also the director of the Te Kotahi Research Institute at the University of Waikato. Together, we have developed the Biocultural Labels, which is a particular way of responding to three key issues that we kind of see in terms of thinking about the rights of Indigenous peoples in relationship to DSI. The first really is thinking about how to recognise Indigenous rights and interests in raw data and DSI within an open data environment. The second is thinking about how to share DSI and to collaborate around ethical access and use in ways consistent with existing community protocols. And the third is thinking about how to negotiate equitable outcomes from the use of DSI, including possibilities and potentials of commercialization. So the 6 labels that we've developed as part of this initiative, and they draw upon a 10-year project around the traditional knowledge labels, which has been working across multiple countries and with multiple communities to develop different kinds of ways of thinking about how do you make Indigenous cultural protocols into digital frameworks that can make an intervention into digital systems. And so the 6 labels, the 6 biocultural labels that we've developed, which you'll see on one side of your screen, the human readability ones, the biocultural label for provenance, the biocultural label for consent verified, the biocultural label for research use, the biocultural label for open to collaboration, and the biocultural label for open to commercialization, and the biocultural label for multiple communities.
Jane, could you slow down a little bit and get the mic a bit closer? The interpreters do have some struggle.
Sure, I think I'm as closest to the mic as I possibly can be, and I will slow down for sure. So within, I think what the key component of what these labels are working to do, both in their human readability and also in their machine readability, which means that they can enter into digital systems and structures and actually create fields for the inclusion of the contextual metadata, which is precisely what Christian was speaking about, is that they communicate 3 key things. They communicate provenance information, they communicate community protocols, and they communicate permissions for how this information can be used into the future. And so in many ways, how they've been developed is to align and to create particular pathways to meet some of these ABS principles. I think that Pierre summed it up very well at the beginning of the panel, or the beginning of this conversation, that databases currently have very limited capacity for enhanced metadata. But technically, this is relatively easy to do. And so another part is that the value of data is in the capacity to compare and contrast. And contextual metadata helps make that difference, as well as affecting data quality. For instance, it helps in establishing value through particular kinds of data characteristics and data attributes. So what the biocultural labels do, and I think this is key, and I'll end on this, is that the biocultural labels start to make invisible associated to traditional knowledge visible within the infrastructures and within the ways in which that data starts to travel. In doing that, it also creates more value in the data. And the benefits that then flow in multiple directions. It flows to IPLCs in terms of understanding where this actually comes from and the innovation and the creativity that has been involved for generations in creating the actual, and that can actually arises from DSI. But it also has value in relationship to data and to science. So it has a social value and a scientific value to add contextual metadata into the systems so that into the future, there's better science. It makes for better science. And it supports innovation and the recognition of Indigenous innovation that informs current and future innovation using and arising from DSI. And that's where I'll end and hand over to the next panelist. Thank you so much.
Great, thank you very much, Jane. I think that tied it very nicely with what Christian was talking about. I think also the points that Pierre was raising, focusing on this as kind of data and metadata and what kind of constructive things can be done with that. I think we're now going to switch focus a little bit. We're going to change gear from kind of focusing on the data and the practical options that may exist to move more into a discussion on other kinds of options, one which would be to focus on Indigenous people's rights, and another to think about multilateral benefit sharing approaches. So our next speaker is Jennifer Tauli-Corpus. Jennifer's an Indigenous lawyer from the Kankana Igorot in the Cordillera region of the Philippines. She's a policy advisor for TEBTEBA, the Indigenous Peoples International Center for Policy Research and Education. And Jennifer will be very well known to many of us because she was the lead for the International Indigenous Forum on Biodiversity at COP 13 in Cancun. So Jennifer, in thinking about shifting the focus a little bit, I kind of wanted to kind of frame it in terms of two questions. Maybe perhaps to give us an outline of the arguments that the IAFB is advancing in relation to the rights of Indigenous peoples. And then secondly, to think about whether the main focus for Indigenous peoples intervention should be more on the international, the multilateral benefit sharing side of things, or whether in reality multiple approaches are needed. So Jennifer, you have the floor.
Thanks very much, Paul, and thank you for the guide questions as well. And thank you to the other speakers for setting the scene. So yeah, so your first question was what is the approach and what is the position basically of the IAFB in relation to DSI? And for the reasons that Pierre outlined, the rights of Indigenous peoples to the territories as well as resources therein, the position that IAFB has taken is that DSI should be within the coverage of the Nagoya Protocol. Now, we were a bit remiss in our engagement, well, in the negotiations of that led to the adoption of the Nagoya Protocol, because a lot of these things, as one of the persons in the chat has said, as a lot of these were left on the cutting room floor, so they weren't included. But we believe that DSI should be covered in the protocol. And one thing that we frequently forget in relation to the Nagoya Protocol is that it recognizes IPLC rights over the genetic resource, as well as to associated traditional knowledge. Now, building on what Shakil presented around the intellectual property system, these rights are actually threefold. So we have the moral rights, which is recognition that Indigenous peoples develop the knowledge based on the close relationship that Indigenous peoples have with the resources in territories. There is also the economic rights model, where Indigenous peoples have the right to benefit from uses of the genetic resources, as well as the information attached, the associated traditional knowledge, and by extension, uses of the digital sequence information. And then finally, one thing that Pierre presented, free, prior, and informed consent, so the exclusive rights model. And this is where we frequently run into roadblocks, where scientists complain and say that it would be unworkable if they had to seek consent every time they use DSI that is that can be traced back to Indigenous peoples. Okay, so which leads me to your second question, Paul, which is, should we be focusing on the option that was presented? And let's forget about FPIC. Let's just focus on the benefit sharing through a global multilateral system. But this is not the position of the IIFP. And the reason is that focusing on benefit sharing rather on both benefit sharing and consent could be a sort of get out of jail free card. So what's to stop users of genetic resources and ATK of Indigenous peoples from just focusing on benefit sharing, saying that all of this has been digitized anyway, therefore we don't need to seek consent, where clearly there are already methodologies that have been developed that would tag or label certain sequences in databases, so DSI that are in databases, and there are ways to associate this data with the Indigenous peoples who own the knowledge or the resource. Okay, so the reason why we don't want to focus solely on a multilateral benefit sharing mechanism is because it might bypass entirely the requirement for consent. So the proposal is that there should be a multiplicity of approaches, such as revised terms and conditions attached to these open access databases. So once there is commercial use, so research is fine, but once there is commercial use, there should be an obligation that kicks in to share the benefits. And also when accessing, when the metadata clearly shows that this DSI is associated with Indigenous peoples, then a due diligence should be required to ascertain what the rules are for uses of this resource or this associated traditional knowledge. And under the moral rights model, there should be we should make sure that uses are not offensive to Indigenous peoples and that Indigenous peoples are recognized and acknowledged as the source of this DSI. Then we also have other approaches, practical approaches, such as, well, participation. So obviously participation of Indigenous peoples in the negotiations and policy setting, but also participation in terms of administration. And I would point to an example in the Philippines, which is also replicated in other countries, where Indigenous peoples are sort of an advisory council that would assist the intellectual property office in identifying whether certain intellectual property rights applications have used traditional knowledge or genetic resources of Indigenous peoples, and in which case this advisory council would then trigger the requirement for presentation of evidence of consent and benefit sharing. And then you have participation in the grievance and redress mechanism. So Indigenous peoples should be able to initiate cases where they have identified that the DSI is clearly associated with an Indigenous people or local community. And then finally, in relation to repatriation, the working group on 8J negotiated a set of voluntary guidelines called the Rutsulijirisaksik guidelines, which talks about repatriation and presents a good practice guide for repatriating traditional knowledge, or basically physically bringing back the knowledge to the Indigenous peoples that own it, but also acknowledging Indigenous peoples as owners. And I would invite everyone to read this set of guidelines. So yes, just to summarize the response, DSI should be covered within the Nagoya Protocol. There are 3 different approaches: acknowledging Indigenous peoples as owners, and following the rules for uses of the genetic resource and traditional knowledge. Then economic rights, so that's the benefit sharing system through a multilateral system or otherwise. And then exclusive rights, or the right to consent, especially in cases where the link to Indigenous peoples is indisputable. And then I concluded with some practical recommendations. Again, thanks for this opportunity, Paul, and to the ABS initiative.
That's absolutely great. Thank you very much, Jennifer. Now, I'm happy to say we have a few minutes for discussion. And one of the things that was occurring to me just listening to the 3 speakers is that somewhere in here we have the question, who is genomics for? Which is, and there we might take the stance that, you know, we get this impression that DSI and genomics are for scientists. But I think when we listen to what Christian was saying, we listen to Jane talking about the biocultural labels, and to Jennifer, we're starting to think about, well, who is all of this ultimately for? Who gets to benefit from this? Who's recognized as contributing to this? Who gets to decide on the benefits themselves? So I just wonder if there are any reflections from the panel on that. Please just feel welcome to go ahead. Let me be a bit more direct in my question then. So Christian, in your work with communities in say Kenya and elsewhere, I mean, do you see a role for Indigenous peoples and local communities in actually determining the priorities for research in animal breeding? Do they have a direct role to play in that?
Yes. As I said, we are producing for the farmers, right? For local communities. It means the objective of ILRI and CTLGH is to meet the demands coming from the local communities. They are the ones who really need the end product that we should be developing. I'll take one case. If we identify, let's say, in any taurine breed, cattle breed, a trait that is contributing to trypanotolerance, for example, but they don't know how to use it, but they know that their animals are being resistant to that specific disease, then we can just see how to apply the genomic tools, first to identify the trait of importance, and see how later we can re-include it into the breeding programs to accelerate the conservations or the development of that specific genetic resources, which is of value for the community. So this is how we discuss with them, and that's why we mostly need to be working with local partners, scientific partners, and local communities to explain to them. And most of the time, we also invite them to some short workshop just to have an overview on how that genetic information is used to bring back to them the information they need. So it is very important. Their contributions to the genomic works is really, really important. It is what really guide our decisions to explore specific traits.
I mean, Jane, do you have any, I mean, it strikes me, and am I right that Maui has now joined us as well? Welcome, Maui. Well, this is a question to Maui or Jane then, is that, you know, where does value lie in this data, and who gets to be recognized? It seems to me to be the key question. I really like, Jane, your argument that this produces, if you like, by recognizing these contributions, it produces multiple beneficiaries that multiple people can win. Do you have any comment, Maui or Jennifer, on this?
Kia ora. Yes, I think there's a couple of different levels of benefit, and there's obviously benefit that arises from the initial project that's taking place, and I think that's what Christian's been, you know, talking about. We want to see, you know, particularly here in New Zealand, I'm sure other places as well, ways in which those sorts of tools and partnerships can directly contribute to outcomes which Indigenous communities are interested in, whether those are sort of breeding programs or whether those are biodiversity or conservation projects. It's just that in the generation of the data, and I think, you know, Pierre represented this really well, the generation of the data through those projects also then becomes available for other ones. And it's trying to ensure that the value that's generated from the data through its next uses also has a feedback loop into the communities.
So just to expand a bit, Jennifer, unless you want to come in.
Yes, we were talking about benefits, and yeah, one thing I would like to point out or comment on is that there are many different funds that have been established. So, for example, the CBD has the Global Environment Facility, the Climate Change Convention has the Green Climate Fund. And one question here is that if the benefits being generated are mostly coming from uses of DSI that's quite closely attached to GRs or TK of Indigenous peoples, how then do we ensure that it is going to the right beneficiaries? So this is one thing that would need to be addressed when we talk about multilateral system. Do we have simplified enough procedures and safeguards in place to ensure that the right people are getting the benefits from this this fund, if it ever gets set up? And how do we make sure that it doesn't go to all these big support NGOs or big NGOs, and, you know, just a very, very small amount trickling down to Indigenous people? So that's one contribution.
Jane, I'm thinking that, you know, what we're seeing coming out of New Zealand, in Africa and elsewhere, is this kind of rise of this kind of participatory approaches to genomics that try and recognize the rights and interests of all of the different parties involved. And we could see the Biocultural Labels scheme as part of that. We can see this in kind of community-based initiatives in Africa. So, I mean, the question then is about the scalability of these kinds of initiatives. Do you have any insight on how well you think they might scale?
I think that's a really important question about the scalability. And we're doing a lot of work, particularly with the labels, as just one initiative or one kind of practical option that can exist, particularly at that metadata level, in relationship to thinking about how that can scale across multiple countries, multiple jurisdictions. And I think what's interesting about it as an initiative is that we are working with practices rather than with law. And we're thinking about what that starts to mean within digital infrastructures. So we're starting to think about like fields. And this is kind of where there's this really important question that arises about to what extent do DSI ecosystems require machine learning tools to support and track provenance across systems. This starts to be a different kind of conversation, but I think it's a really important conversation, because how do we track and trace the provenance and then what does that mean for where the benefits and how we can create and support where those benefits need to go, exactly as Jennifer was talking about, and also kind of tapping into precisely what Christian was speaking to. So for me, there is the capacity technologically to do this, and to think about where the machine learning capacity can actually maneuver around and support this kind of work.
That's a great observation. And of course, we have things like the CARE principles, the FAIR principles that aim to be findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable, which have now been very widely adopted, and the Indigenous peoples focused CARE principles. I mean, so we can, I think, start to imagine the construction of a system that will scale in recognizing the rights and interests of the variety of actors involved. I think we have a more challenging question, and we have 3 minutes, which relates to the proposed ideas around a global multilateral benefit sharing mechanism, a kind of, as I've described it elsewhere, a kind of giant fund in the sky. And I think as Jennifer was helpfully problematizing this, in the sense that, you know, is this going to be some remote fund or something that's in the sky that is remote from the communities, when what is actually required is to move closer? So I just wonder if you have any thoughts about, I mean, we've seen things like the GEF small grants program, the plant treaty, for example, created a benefit sharing mechanism that channels resources to directly to farmers and communities. If you have any further thoughts on that.
Can I just sort of want to add a comment here before we get into the sort of the multilateral part? And that's
sure, go ahead. Sure.
Yeah, so just the use of the open to collaboration and open to commercialization label is really about trying to ensure that next users can actually connect back to the communities around the projects. It's not just an exercise that's extractive, which is the data's being generated, now you can go and use them, and we'll give you a little, we'll give you a few cents out of what comes out of it, and we'll get into this sort of negotiation about what the value of that should be. More benefit is going to come out if those other users connect back to that community and can derive other sorts of benefits, whether it's capacity building, whether it's sort of the focus of the project. But that can only happen if you can create a relationship. And you can't create a relationship once it's sort of disembodied from that original data generation activity. So I think that's an important thing to try and keep in mind as we're thinking about the range of different options that around how value can be generated.
Okay, that's great. We're very much now out of time, unfortunately, so I think we'll have to park the discussion on what a global multilateral benefit sharing mechanism might look like, but of course I'm sure we have plenty of time for that discussion later. I think, Maui, that focusing on relationships and the quality of relationships, as you were kind of pointing to towards the end there, is a great way to end in thinking about how do we recognize the contributions that people are making in these domains. So thanks very much to all of you for a very kind of enlightening kind of panel presentations. As we said before, this is the start of a discussion and not the end of one. So with that, I would like to hand over to Suhail for the closing remarks.
Idea was not only me to say something to close, but also to have an indigenous voice from Africa with Lucy Mullinkay. And I don't know, Lucy, whether you are with us.
Yes, I've been with you since the beginning.
Okay, and yes, Lucy. So you have listened to the panel and also the introductory remarks by Pierre and Shakil, and now to conclude a bit from a indigenous people's perspectives on what you would see as now, let's say, key elements and also key challenges when bringing together aspects of ATK, IPLCs, and DSI.
Thank you very much, Suhail. I think it was quite an interesting discussion that was there from the introduction of Pierre. And this particular topic, as already Jennifer explained very clearly, is a topic whereby indigenous people, not only from Africa, but also from the other parts of the regions, would really like to understand a step-by-step on how to go on. And I think what I could really say is that it's very important that we continue, as you already indicated, there are some series that will continue. And also I think the CBD has a series of them that they are going to also have, so that we can be able to understand. For me, I'm still actually trying to understand as much as possible, since the last time when we were in Pretoria and we had the first presentation on DSI and how it's going to work and so on, which I found it very, very interesting. And today in particular, also, I think Pierre started very well with the introduction and having all the other presentation come in also and give their part on it, and also how WIPO, and especially WIPO on the different aspects that they are undertaking in terms of trying to make sure that their online courses, their online discussions, and this is very encouraging, and that's what actually I would encourage more of our indigenous people to follow up and to go to the WIPO websites and also the ABS initiative to be able to read more and to be able to understand. And I'm sure some of them are their voices recorded so they could be able to really understand it. We are also happy that there was the representative who also talked about the livestock animals and other issues and the relationship with the DSI and the ABS and the genetic resources and the traditional knowledge, which is of great concern and of course great interest to most of the nomadic pastoralists around the regions in Africa and so on. So I think this is really interesting. Jennifer, thank you so much for bringing out our perspective. And I think we need to continue discussing among ourselves so that we know exactly where to place ourselves. And I'm glad you also say that this is very, very important, and especially on the process of Nagoya Protocol, that we are able to follow and participate effectively. And as I said, there's still a lot for people to understand. We still have to really dig deeper to be able to know the processes and to know exactly how we can be able to relate this to our usual discussions on Nagoya Protocol, access and benefit sharing, and other areas of discussion. There was also one other thing that I didn't want to miss out, and I really thought I wanted to understand a bit more clearly, if at all it was more presented, that was about the protocols. And I took a bit of notes on the way the discussion was going on, and the presenter really did well to be able to move on to some particular areas. And I think this is also a good subject to introduce later, because especially for Africa now, we have different communities where we are really introducing, and we are working with them very closely on the community protocols. So it will be really very good to continue also following and see how related it is with the DSI and which areas to particularly focus on and to be able to understand. So I think to me, it's been a very good discussion, a very interesting one. I didn't want Paul to stop asking more questions. I think I wanted him to ask a bit more so that we can understand, but I want to really thank the ABS initiative for bringing up this, and I'm sure with the questions that may be coming on the floor, it's something that we can be able to continue discussing it and being able to follow up the process as Indigenous people. So I think, Suhail, I'll say thank you, and I'll stop there so that we don't run over time. Thank you so much, everyone, and the panelists. Thank you all very much.
Thanks a lot, Lucy Mullen-Kay from the Indigenous Peoples Information Network in Africa. And yes, indeed, you were also referring to the questions and the chat, and that will provide us some further food for thought on this long journey to not only probably the working group, but to COP, and then if it comes then to any implementation also after COP under the Global Biodiversity Framework. What I wanted to do is to look a little bit ahead, but not without looking back. The partnership between Norway and South Africa, a double country-led partnership, is what is enabling us to organize and develop these webinars. Once again, it is aiming as an informal process to support the science policy dialogue as it's mandated by COP, and we're doing this in a very close collaboration with the CBD Secretariat, and also, of course, under the supervision of the co-chairs of the working group. Now, what is new is that you will find on our website, the address you see here on the slide, the synthesis report on a previous webinar, which was on the co-chairs panel. So we had a very interesting panel on our own that was discussing the potential criteria for assessing DSI policy options. This report is online, and it may also then serve as further information and also points of departure for reflection for the further debate that we are having in front of us. So on today there was, as a technical webinar, the role of Indigenous peoples and ATK in the DSI debate. There will be two further stepstones, technical stepstones, before we come to a global dialogue. I'll say some words on that in a minute. So on 2nd of June, we will focus on the question of capacity to generate DSI and to use DSI in the international debate. I mean, in all the policy options, or related to all the policy options, there's always the question of capacity development. The question is, what kind of capacity, of whom, what would be needed to get to a more just distribution of capacity? How does that refer to questions of technology transfer, and of course to biotechnology and the Cartagena Protocol? So this is on June 2nd. Then on June 16th, we are busy pulling together elements of an webinar that will look at the contribution of digital sequence information to commercial applications. So we're not going that pathway that we're distinguishing between commercial and non-commercial research, but rather to see, okay, what kind of commercial applications are already out there, how were they developed, what was the pathway, and how do we see trends also to inform the further debate. And the further debate, at least from our end, will have then one interesting cluster, which are the so-called global dialogues, where the initiative in collaboration with Norway and South Africa will invite governments and non-governmental representatives to be part of a Chatham House dialogue. You will see that this is with a focus again, to look at the policy options on the table, to also reflect upon the online consultations that took place against decision-making criteria for policy decisions. And this is then going to be a series of events with a global kickoff, and then 3 regional meetings, time zone specific, one for the Asia Pacific, one for Africa and Europe, and one for the Americas, where then, as I said, governmental and non-governmental stakeholders should then have the opportunity to see where there is possible common ground and where still divergences are. And this is then, of course, to inform the open-ended working group. We will hopefully get some 120 people all together. But of course, it's necessary to inform also a broader audience, and this is why we have planned to have a reflection panel on this very global dialogue on 20th July, still ahead of the working group. Yes, so this is what we have in front of us in the short run, and we will keep you then, of course, updated on further developments. For the time being, then I would like to thank you for your participation, your attendance, in particular the panelists, then those who provided then the input, the technical input, of course, also the facilitator and all the technical colleagues. As I said, we will take due note of all the elements that have been put in the chat, also questions of inclusivity and representation of IPLCs. And please be aware that then in this dialogue sessions that we are going to organize, that will also in particular will ensure that participation of indigenous peoples and local communities takes place. In that regard, once again, thanks a lot, and hopefully see and hear you in the next webinar or event on DSI. Thanks.